welcome to Nailing It Down, a Barn Blog educational production. And today I'm talking about the tragedy of the commons, its history, its context, its limitations, and why it has not totally been debunked. It is very similar to the iron law of oligarchy. What has been debunked, I'm going to go ahead and spoil up front, is that it's a universal problem. But it is actually a problem under very specific conditions. Now, the term tragedy of the commons was really made famous in 1968 by Garrett Hardin. Hardin, who was writing in science, was concerned with the depletion of natural resources. He was an ecologist. He also had some interesting ideas about population control, eugenics, and multi-ethnicism that we can get into later. But that is not actually all that relevant to the tragedy of the commons. What is interesting about the tragedy of the commons, what Garrett Hardin used to argue about it, isn't actually really its origins. When most Marxists refer to it, they refer to the writings of the British early economist William Foster Lloyd. Lloyd developed this concept really in 1833 as a kind of post-mortem justification for the Enclosure Acts in the prior century. All right. Now, later economist H. Scott Gordon was to really develop this out. But the justification of what really becomes the kernel of the tragedy of the commons is in Lloyd's 2 lectures on the checks to the population. And if it sounds like this has been influenced by Malthusianism, you are absolutely correct. Now, what is the tragedy of commons in William Foster Lloyd? Well, here's how Lloyd does it in a hypothetical example. If a person puts more cattle into his own field, the amount of substance which they consume is all deducted from which has at command of his original stock. And if before it there has been no more sufficiency of pasture, he reaps no benefit from additional cattle, which is gained in one way, being lost in another. But if he puts more cattle on a common, the food which they consume forms a deduction from which is shared by all cattle, and as well as others as his own, in proportion to their number, and only a small part of it is taken from his own cattle. It is an enclosed pasture. There's a point of saturation, if I may so call it, by which I mean the barrier on which considerations of interest, beyond which no prudent man will add his stock. In common also, there's also, in a like manner, a point of saturation, but this position of the point in the 2 cases is obviously different. Were a number of adjoining pastures already fully stocked to once thrown open and converted into vast common, the position of saturation would immediately be changed. Meaning that, according to Lloyd, there is a tendency of the free rider problem to be a problem in common areas. Now, Marxist, anarchists, and other socialists have pointed out that, well, the commons were used by peasants for hundreds and hundreds of years without said problem, so why do we need to actually enclose the area? But it's interesting because what Hardin does, and going back to Garrett Hardin, and so we're jumping about 120 years in the future into the 1960s, more than that, 140 years in the future, into the 1960s. Hardin actually uses this for the need for population control in a very intervening state. So in one argument, in Lloyd, you have the justification of private property and the state aiding in private property to increase efficiency. Now, this is very different than the normal story of property that you get from most liberal capitalists, and most capitalists or liberal capitalists, because they will talk about the Lockean myth, which is basically that ownership is justified by the improvement of land. That obviously was never true in the enclosures. Lloyd does try to attempt it more honestly with a hypothetical and deductively rational argument. It is deductively rational, right? It does seem like if you own the land and you deduce from your own stocks, there's less incentive to free ride, and free rider problems are real. However, it should be noted that even early on, people pointed out that Lloyd's deductive argument was entirely hypothetical, all right, and that the misuse of long-held common lands was actually more common once the enclosures began than during the enclosure, meaning that open access systems collapsed in overuse, maybe because we have incentivized their use for profits in a way they were not incentivized before. All right. Now, ecologists picked this up. And again, as I said, Garrett Hardin was a scientist and ecologist who thought that under conditions of overpopulation, freedom in unmanaged commons brings ruin to all. Hardin actually then later redressed this in 1991, saying that commons are fine as long as they are managed. So he mitigated his statement to the tragedy of the unmanaged commons, but still posited that there needed to be a strong state apparatus to keep people from free riding, and thus ruining the ecology and also the gene pool and stuff, according to Hardin. There's a lot of pernicious things there. This is where it comes into play. What we discover, however, in Hardin and Ostrom's work in 2009, for which she won a Nobel Memorial Prize in the economic sciences, one of the few that I think may actually be deserved, for her book Governing Commons, included examples of local communities who are able to manage the common without regulations or privatization, meaning without the government or the market stepping in and playing a role. All right. Thus, risk can be mitigated through collective action in particular context. However, that context is pretty simple. You need high trust communities with knowledge of the area in a non-competitive environment where people understand the depletion of their stocks, meaning that this can emerge without specialist or markets. Thus, and what markets would do in this case would place the risk on the individual of overgrazing. So the commons can be regulated, but only in local levels. Now, this doesn't bring a lot of hope to the ecologists. And while socialists and anarcho-socialists and communists like the idea that social running of an area can be achieved through cooperation and non-hierarchical planning, you got plenty of evidence for that in Ostrom's work. There's also the fact that that isn't always the case. Dieter Helm argues that we should look at Eleanor Ostrom's work as being context specific, because we do have examples. And he says this in the book Natural Capital Valuing the Planet, of peasant societies or agrarian societies still overtaxing and collapsing their immediate environment. So is there a tragedy of commons or isn't there? Well, it seems like many things, the problem that we have with the tragedy of the commons is that it's not a universal law. we find this statement of universal law gone all the way back to Aristotle. In fact, Hardin's the one who quoted Aristotle. That which is common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care. Men pay the most attention to what is their own. They care less for what is common. All right. But that's what Aristotle says. All right. And that's where Lloyd gets his logic from. And that's where Hardin kind of pulls off. And we see Lloyd justifies the privatization of capital and the privatization of land, although that was a state action, which is something that modern capitalists don't like to admit. And earlier political economists of capital were a little bit more honest about, with the exception of the theorist prior like John Locke. Ostrom's answer actually doesn't immediately have the clear implications for politics that you might think. For example, we can see that both leftists and anarchists often like Eleanor Ostrom's answer, but I've also seen libertarian capitalists like Eleanor Ostrom's answer, because it implies that you don't need a state to do the mitigating factor, and that the local businessmen could actually, in their private interest, divide up the commons in a fair way without the state intervening. See, now you can either take the reading of Eleanor Ostrom's work as supporting a kind of relative power egalitarian socialist answer to the tragedy of commons, but one that is very localist, and thus would be kind of interesting to factor into any socialist planning regimes. Or you can take a pro-business reading of Eleanor Ostrom's work. Then if you add that Dieter Helm is correct, that we can't say that Eleanor Ostrom's solution is universal, because even in pre-capitalist economies, there were examples of incentive structures that did cause the tragedy of commons to actually happen. We have to start asking ourselves, well, what is the common factors? And I listed a few in the beginning, in the societies that Eleanor Ostrom studies, that proves that the tragedy of commons isn't inevitable. Now, this is a kind of socialist thinking, and it's not one that we often talk about, because this is not one of the many debates socialists tend to be all up in, but it's important to consider, because many people will cite Eleanor Ostrom's work as support of their politics, but it can be read multiple ways. Two, the tragedy of the commons was not only about capital. It was also used by Garrett Hardin to argue that we needed highly interventionist elements of the state into controlling population through birth control and maybe even eugenics. Now, eugenics here would be negative eugenics, not positive eugenics, and negative eugenics would be mostly things like sterilization and birth control. But they are still pretty problematic. Furthermore, as we can see, a strain that runs through all of these assumptions, whether they be Lloyd's early justification of the enclosures, H. Scott Gordon's work on Lloyd, or Garrett Hardin's use of the tragedy of commons in ecology, they all actually have neo-Malthusian assumptions. They assume that the development of productive capacities does not really limit our ability to use resources. The resource loss is going to be pretty much one-to-one, and that really hasn't even been true. Even a fairly conservative thinker like Peter Turchin has illustrated that it's not the case that Malthusian calculuses apply once you have industrial development. And in fact, that's one of the laws of cleodynamics, according to Turchin, changes, i.e. the Malthusian calculus is removed once you have industrial agricultural capacity. Now, the tragedy of the commons has all kinds of things, including the solutions to the tragedy of commons. So before Eleanor Ostrom, there were considered to be governmental solutions, which is privatization and regulation. So you see both tiers of liberalism, the private property element, but also the government regulatory state element. Internalizing externalities, making sure that externalities are paid for by single party actors. You had solutions, which is, Hardin and Ostrom points out the tragedy of commons is not as prevalent when locals have to come up with solutions to the common problems themselves. They do so by mostly respecting agreements to which everyone benefits. And Ostrom had shown that this has been maintained in places like the Swiss Alps to this day from the middle of the 16th century, actually the beginning in 1517. She also pointed out that many tribal societies had done the same. Douglas Johnson, building on Eleanor Ostrom's work and his own work, pointed out that Nemonic pastoralist had actually done this going in Africa and the Middle East going all the way back, and that it was even obvious to people such as Ibn Khaldun that one of the reasons why pastoralists and agriculturalists tended to be at odds with one another is their ways of mitigating what we would call the tragedy of the commons were different, and they didn't trust each other because of it, because one could destabilize the other, leading to overpopulation or desertification or whatever. So I think you can see in this another kind of complication, right? That, like, yes, the high trust societies that share a mode of production and by that we don't just mean like capitalism, we also mean like pastoralism, hunter-gatherism. These are modes of reproducing your social life, your ability to both exist as a species, your biological life, and ensuring that you have food and can protect yourself. All right. So we can see that different kinds of social forms, are modes of production, because they're both social forms and mode of productions, would have different incentives for how they would work out, how individuals solve what could be seen as the use of communal resources, aka the overexploitation of communal resources, aka the tragedy of the commons. All of these point out, though, under capitalist conditions, there is an incentive sector to overexploit resources, because there's a need for profits to be turned at all time. But as I pointed out in the governmental solutions given to the tragedy of the commons, privatization, regulation, and internalizing externalities, or charging people for what they do to the collective whole, you see that there's a conflict in what we think about as right and left in this. Left liberals tend to favor regulation, right liberals tend to favor privatization, both of which are considered ways to handle the tragedy of the commons. And in fact, if you take Hardin seriously, they're both needed. All right. Hardin's work has other things you can criticize for it. You can think of the problem of common property is separate from open access resources. You can think of demographic transitions being kind of disproof to Garrett Hardin's steady state ecology. David Harvey says the disposition of indigenous populations of America by productive colonists, for instance, which used to justify indigenous populations to not produce value, could be seen as a critique of this, because if you don't produce value, then you don't need to think in terms of value either. So one of the things Harvey is getting at by that comment is that that basically a lot of these arguments have it both ways, and that what are the things the tragedy of common is dependent on is the idea that people have incentives to compete against each other for acclamation of goods. All right. Now, there's a lot of things that we can talk about. The collective action problem is tied into this. Bounded rationality is tied into this. There's something called the social trap. There's something called the race to the bottom. These are all things in kind of neoclassical and classical economics, and in sociology and ecology you have to deal with. The reason why I bring this up is because we know there are societies that have found an answer to the tragedy of commons. We also know that there are societies, even non-capitalist ones, who don't. We can't say the tragedy of the commons is not real. What we can say is it's not a universal tendency or law. And that in a socialist society, we're going to have to work out ways to figure out how to manage common resources. And if the goal is to render the functions of society outside of the state, which the goal of communism is eventually to do, explicitly stated in Marx, because states have to compete against each other, and we don't want that kind of competition anywhere on Earth eventually. We don't want states competing for resources. We want this socially managed. Then we have to look at the societies that handle this and the societies that don't, and try to figure out the common traits between the ones that work and the ones that don't, so that we can build incentive structures to do that. All right. That's why this is important for socialists to think about. It's not just, oh, I've debunked the tragedy of the commons, which fine. But you haven't debunked social parasitism, nor have you gotten rid of the collective action problem without actually looking at the structures in which people, without top-down enforcement, figured out how to do this amongst themselves. All right. Hopefully this is an exercise in thinking through problems that are talked about in more contemporary discourse. I'll link in the show notes. Continue to nail it down. Thank you. Have a good day.